Okay, so I want to say before I start this video, just warning ahead, there is a lot of Gacha Heat in this video that's going to be shown. Not a lot, there's a couple pictures, but it's still going to be shown. But I wanted to go over some comments I got on my last video stating that this is not Gacha Heat, which is untrue because if it was anybody else with a lower platform doing videos like this, that would be titled as Gacha Heat in the community. So, yeah. But the first comment says, I know it's wrong, but Gacha is not only for kids. If they don't like Gacha Heat, don't watch it. I'm not on his side. I'm trying to say that Gacha is not only for kids. I understand what you're saying, and I agree with you. My response to this is, I understand that Gacha is not only for kids, as, Looney had to actually change the whole game to create it for both kids and adults, as he didn't expect a bunch of adults and kids to be going around making sexual content with a fucking kids game. It's a dress-up game. Do you think anybody's going to expect an adult to play a dress-up game? I have a lot to say about this one, but basically they say, I'm on his side. He doesn't make Gacha Heat. The content he makes is not Heat. Gacha Heat is different. Can't you people leave him be? What would you feel like if someone started to rant over your content? This had to be said. Okay, first off, there's little videos of him having his characters hold their little wee-wees as milk is on their hands in that area. And apparently that's not Gacha Heat, but, apparently, yeah, that's not Gacha Heat, okay? A guy in a dress-up game is holding his wee-wee and having milk coming out of his... Yeah, that's not Gacha Heat, that's not at all. Okay, Gacha Heat and making, just very affectionate and kind of slightly sexualized content is two different things. I can understand making out intensively, cool, you have a very affectionate relationship in this pixelated game, or whereas Gacha Heat is literally, you know what I mean. You can tell the difference. And I understand that a lot of people don't really want to understand the difference, but it's Gacha Heat, and you can't really change it. It's disgusting. And if somebody decided to rant over my content, that would mean that I have done something bad that people didn't like, and I would understand their reasoning, and I would go and try and fix that, and I would apologize sincerely and not make a vent video about it, saying how everybody is hating on me and I can't take fucking criticism. But, and no, this did not have to be said, as a lot of your statements are easily debunked. It did not have to be said. Thank you.